The big conflict is coming. The U.S. ran 22 war scenarios with China over Taiwan, and concerning the casualties, sunk aircraft carriers and thousands of victims, it stunned U.S. Pentagons with the results. The American Pentagon was numbed by the results of these 22 new scenarios between China and Taiwan that ran a specialized think tank. It's the second set of simulations carried out by the American think tank Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, within a 6-month period. In fact, the scenarios were repeated 24 times to convince the American leadership of the devastating consequences of a conflict that far exceeds the conflict in Ukraine. The Americans are 100% sure that the new war is a matter of time, and in fact, this new conflict will involve US and Japan. That is why they gave the name for the first battle of the next war to the simulation they ran. The American think tank, Center for Strategic International Studies, CSIS, concluded that the Chinese invasion of Taiwan will fail, but at a huge cost to the U.S. Chinese and Taiwanese soldiers, such as thousands victims and at least 2 aircraft carriers sunk, unleashing Taiwan's navy along with its economy. According to the simulation, a People's Liberation Army PLA invasion of Taiwan in 2026 would cause heavy casualties on all sides, namely the US, China, Japan, and Taiwan, even though the Allied force led by US would emerge victorious. The report notes the following. A war over Taiwan could leave the victorious US military in a situation just as crippled as the defeated Chinese forces. At the end of the conflict, at least 2 US aircraft carriers would be at the bottom of the Pacific, and China's modern navy, which is the largest in the world, would have been disbanded. The exhibition is entitled The First Battle of the Next War, and it includes 22 war scenarios. CSIS stressed that this analysis was necessary because previous government and private war simulations were too small or too opaque. They also wanted to give the public and policymakers a real look at how the Taiwan Strait conflict might play out. CSIS ran this war game 24 times to answer 2 fundamental questions. Would the invasion succeed, and at what cost? The possible answers to these 2 questions are negative and overwhelming, the CSIS report states. And the previous report, US, China, Taiwan war simulation, huge losses for Allied forces, 150 warships, and 900 aircraft on the bottom. Results and estimates. The United States and Japan are losing dozens of ships, hundreds of aircraft, and thousands of soldiers. Such losses would damage U.S. global standing for many years, the report said. In most scenarios, the U.S. Navy loses 2 aircraft carriers and 10 to 20 large surface ships, about 3,200 U.S. soldiers in 3 weeks of war, nearly half of what the U.S. has lost in 2 decades of fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. China will also suffer a lot. Its navy will be in ruins. The core of its amphibious forces will be disbanded. Tens of thousands will become prisoners of war, they said. The report estimates that China will suffer about 10,000 victim soldiers, losing 155 fighters and 138 large ships. In summary, the situation showed that the U.S. Navy lost up to 20 large displacement warships and about 3,200 victims over the course of 3 weeks. China would have lost about 10,000 victims, 155 military aircraft, and 138 warships. Taiwan would lose about 3,500 soldiers and its entire fleet, consisting of a total of 26 destroyers and frigates completely sunk. And finally, Japan could lose more than 100 fighter aircraft and 26 warships. The report said that to prevent China from eventually taking control of Taiwan, there must be 4 constants that emerge among the 24 iterations of the war games. Taiwan's ground forces must be able to contain the Chinese bridgeheads. The U.S. must be able to use its bases in Japan for military operations. The U.S. must have long-range anti-ship missiles to strike PLA Navy from afar and en masse. the U.S. must fully arm Taiwan before the conflict begins and immediately move into any theater of war with its own forces. Ukraine model cannot be applied, they said. In their analysis of the situation, the simulation, CSIS experts stressed that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan cannot be the so-called Ukrainian model, was imposed because with the start of the war it would not be possible to provide additional supplies to Taiwan from the U.S. and its allied countries. So for this reason, CSIS concluded that the U.S. should provide as many weapons as possible to help Taiwan adequately prepare for an upcoming Chinese attack. Once the war starts, it's impossible to get troops or supplies into Taiwan, so it's a very different situation from Ukraine, where the United States and its allies were able to send supplies to Ukraine continuously. Whatever the Taiwanese are going to fight with, they must have it when the war starts. Washington will need to start acting soon if it is to respond to some of CSIS's recommendations for winning a conflict in Taiwan, the think tank said. The Center for Strategic and International Studies recommended to both the U.S. and Taiwan to fortify U.S. bases in Japan and Guam against Chinese missile attacks, moving naval forces to smaller, more survivable ships, prioritization of submarines, prioritizing sustainable bomber forces over fighter forces, production of cheaper fighters. Taiwan is pushing towards a similar strategy, arming itself with simpler weapons platforms instead of expensive ships that are unlikely to survive a Chinese first strike. Those policies would make victory less costly for the U.S. military, but the toll would still be high, the CSIS report said. The United States may win a Pyrrhic victory, suffering more in the long run than the defeated Chinese. And the report said winning is not everything. This is by War News 247, and I've translated this for you from a Greek article. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box